Good afternoon, teachers. For the second part of the multiplier effect video, we're going to go from having a basic understanding of why the multiplier effect exists to going over the actual mechanics of how do you find the multiplier and then how do you use the multiplier to solve for changes in GDP. So we're going to walk through today what exactly the main components of the multiplier are, and then we'll wrap it up with using it to close inflationary and recessionary gaps in our aggregates by aggregate demand model. So step one in finding the multiplier is we have to figure out what a population's spending behavior versus their savings behavior is going to be. These two behaviors are known in AP Macro as MPC, or the marginal propensity to consume, which tells us how much of their income they spend, and MPS, the marginal propensity to save, which tells us how much of their income they're going to save. Now, there is one notable thing here that the students tend to get a little bit confused on, and that is that the MPS, the S in MPS is saving. Sometimes they want to turn the S into spending. I always point out to them that in eco, the proper term for spending is going to be consumption. So the MPS, the S is for saving, not for spending. It is the C that is for consumption in MPC, the marginal propensity to consume. The formulas for these two things are relatively easy. So what we're dealing with here are marginal dollars. So if you give consumers a dollar above and beyond the dollars they already have, MPC and MPS attempts to answer the question, what are they going to do with that dollar? And for the purposes of AP Macro, we presume that there's basically only two things they can do with that additional dollar. That they can either spend it on consumption or they can save it for future use. The only important thing here is to point out to the kids that we once again are talking about marginal dollars. So this may be different. This behavior here might be different from what they're doing with the current income they're earning. Sometimes I might be spending a lot of my current income, but if you give me additional dollars, I may actually save more of it, or vice versa might be the case. So we're dealing with marginal dollars here, not with their current level of income. So because we're presuming that the only two options for what consumers can do with marginal dollars is either to spend them or to save them, that actually makes it relatively easy to find MPC or MPS once you have the other variable. So because their only options are spending or saving, that means that each additional dollar they get, each marginal dollar, will either be spent, or some percentage of it will be spent and some percentage of it will be saved, meaning that MPC plus MPS will always equal 1. So you never actually have to solve for both MPC and MPS. Once I know MPS, I know that 1 minus MPS is going to give me MPC, and if I have MPC, I know that 1 minus MPC is going to give me MPS. Either way, the formula for finding MPC is going to be change in spending divided by change in disposable income. And the formula for finding MPS is going to be the change in savings over the change in disposable income. Once I've solved for MPC and MPS, I basically have all the information I need to go out and find the multiplier. And then once I find that multiplier, I can use it to solve for changes in gross domestic product based on differing actions that the government might take. So for the purposes of this particular unit, there's going to be potentially three different multipliers the students will need to know, and they'll need to know not only how to calculate them, but what to do with them once they calculate it. So depending on exactly what the government action is going to be, there's a different multiplier associated with each of those. So the most common one the AP exam is going to ask you about is going to be the spending multiplier, sometimes referred to as the Keynesian multiplier. The spending multiplier is useful for whenever there's a change in consumer spending, a change in government spending, a change in investment spending coming from businesses, or to a lesser degree, and not very commonly used, a change in net export spending. The multiplier here is going to be 1 over the marginal propensity to save, or 1 over 1 minus MPC, since 1 minus MPC is MPS. What the spending multiplier is going to tell us is that for each additional dollar of consumer spending, government spending, export spending, or investment spending, that number of additional spending times the spending multiplier will tell us the change in GDP. An important lesson from the spending multiplier is that government spending, consumer spending, investment spending, and export spending, it doesn't actually have a different effect on the economy. It doesn't depend on what type of spending it is. So a dollar of consumer spending has the exact same effect as a dollar of government spending, et cetera, et cetera. The other two multipliers the students will need to know here come when the government decides to change taxes. So there's basically two ways the government can go about changing GDP in the economy, one of which is to change spending through various different policies we'll get to later on. The other is that they can change GDP by changing the marginal tax rates. And the reason that this works is if you change people's marginal tax rates, it affects their ability to engage in consumer spending. So depending on whether you want consumers to have more disposable income to spend or less disposable income to spend, you can either raise or lower their taxes to achieve essentially the same goal as changing spending. So when we cut taxes, lowering people's taxes increases their disposable income, which results in higher levels of consumer spending and causes the economy to grow, causes an increase in GDP. The formula for it when the government chooses to cut people's taxes, that multiplier is going to be MPC over MPS. So it's a slightly different formula from the spending multiplier. And when you actually plug in your numbers here, you'll find out that the tax cut multiplier is always going to be one less than the spending multiplier is. So if the spending multiplier is 5, the tax cut multiplier is going to be 4. And so forth and so on. So if I know the spending multiplier, I automatically already know what the tax cut multiplier is without actually having to solve for it. And if I know the tax cut multiplier, I automatically know what the spending multiplier is without having to solve for it. So that's an interesting piece of information that'll save the kids time on the AP exam. If you can solve for one, you automatically know both. On the other hand, if the government is looking to decrease consumer spending by reducing disposable income, they can actually increase taxes. Now, in practice, this isn't something that happens all that often, but in theory, they certainly could. If the government chooses to raise taxes, it's actually going to shrink GDP by reducing consumer spending. So all we do for finding the multiplier when taxes are going up is to create it to where it's negative MPC over MPS, and you'll end up with a negative multiplier. So for example, let's say that the multiplier for the tax cut multiplier is 3. That means a $100 decrease in taxation would increase GDP by $300. But if your taxation multiplier was negative 3, that means that a $100 increase in taxation would shrink GDP by $300. So they're essentially work the same way. It's just one's going to be a negative number because we're shrinking GDP, and the other is going to be a positive number because we're raising GDP. Now, once we've solved for the various multipliers that we'll need, we can actually go through it and solve for the change in GDP. As you've seen, I've done a couple of different scenarios here so that we can actually see how to apply this to different types of FRQ questions on the AP exam. So at its core, the formula for solving for the change in GDP is that the change in GDP is equal to the change in spending times the spending multiplier, or the change in taxation times the taxation multiplier. So whichever change it is, if it's spending, you use the spending multiplier. If it's taxes, you use the taxation multiplier, and you'll get the same, you'll get the correct answer here. So for our example here, we're going to assume that we have an economy with a marginal propensity to consume of 0.75. So if we have an MPC of 0.75, that means the spending multiplier is 1 divided by 0.25, which gives us a spending multiplier of 4, and a taxation multiplier of 0.75 divided by 0.25, giving us a taxation multiplier of 3. If we know that the spending multiplier is 4, we automatically know the taxation multiplier is 3, or negative 3 if we're raising taxes in this particular scenario. So for these 4 scenarios we're going to walk through real quick, we're just going to assume the government chooses to engage in different fiscal policy actions. We'll get into fiscal policy in a little bit more in the next video, but let's just kind of run through some example scenarios to make sure that the kids actually know how to do the calculations. I found that when I'm explaining it, sometimes they get it, or they'll tell me that they get it, but when you actually put numbers on the paper, sometimes they get a little bit confused. So let's say in scenario 1 that the government chooses to increase government spending by $100. Assuming that our spending multiplier is 4, which is 1 over 0.25, this will result in an end increase in GDP of $400. Should the government choose to decrease spending by $100, it would shrink GDP by $400. So the spending multiplier works both ways. The spending multiplier works if you're increasing spending, it's growing GDP times the multiplier. If you're decreasing spending, it's shrinking GDP by that multiplier. In example number 3, we have an example where the government chooses to cut taxes by $100. This is going to make our increase in GDP $100 times the tax cut multiplier, which is MPC over MPS. So it's 100 times 0.75 divided by 0.25. 0.75 divided by 0.25 is 3, giving us an end increase of GDP of $300. And last but not least, should the government choose to raise taxes, it'll just be a negative 3 multiplier, meaning that a $100 increase in taxation would result in a decrease in GDP of $300. So once we have the multipliers, all we have to do to apply these multipliers to an aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, the only additional thing we need to be able to do is to calculate the size of either the inflationary or the recessionary gap. So the easy way to do this is that due to algebra, we don't actually have to do all that much work. So let's say that there was a $10,000 recessionary gap. So what this tells us is that X times $4 worth of spending will equal $10,000. So if I wanted to close a $10,000 recessionary gap through a change in spending, I would rearrange that equation with algebra and do $10,000 divided by 4, which would give me the required change in spending, or what we call a stimulus, and that would be $2,500. And you could do the same thing if the government wanted to close that gap through a decrease in taxation, except it would be $10,000 divided by 3 because the tax multiplier is 3, whereas the spending multiplier was 4. We'll actually apply this scenario to some graphs in our next video, but this is a good place to start making sure the kids can do basic math. You may want to tell them that on the AP exam, because they're not going to have a calculator, they're going to be given marginal propensities to consume that are relatively easy to do in their heads. So they'll see MPCs of like 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.25. I always tell them on the AP exam that if they're doing math and they end up with a really ugly number that, they couldn't reasonably be expected to get done in their head in under 30 seconds, then they're probably doing something wrong. So they're going to have nice, easy numbers. They're going to give them nice, round numbers for their multipliers. So there's really only a couple of options as to what the AP exam will give them here. So if they start to freak out about not having a calculator, just explain to them the numbers that they're going to be given are nice and simple and pretty, and that they shouldn't have to use a calculator to find